saying, ironically, I just decided to become an academic on the day that I turned 1/3 of a century old. This happened. I woke up in the morning and thought, where the hell's my life going? And I thought it was going nowhere given the job I was in at the time. And I went into work that day and resigned. And tomorrow I turn 2/3 of a century old. 66 and 2/3. So I'm writing a retrospective, which is it started as a little thing for my Patreon supporters, and partly what I was writing it for was an intellectual biography, sort of to show another way of how I reached the approach I have to economics. As a sort of way of saying to you people, there's other ways to achieve. I've only got to the stage I'm just about to start the job that I resigned from to become an academic, up to 25,000 words. So I'll be posting that sometime tomorrow, maybe accessible outside my Patreon supporters, I'm not sure yet, but so it's rather nice you've got this initiative starting on my 2/3 of a century day. So back to just finishing off about what we should be doing given our current situation. Look at what climate scientists are talking about, really look at it, stop listening to the economists. We need to build models that are based on this sort of data. So Toll was disparaging this paper on the basis of Stefan not knowing much about biology. They said there are 16 authors in the paper, I'm sure one of them filled the gap. And what they did was talk about different elements of the global climate system, for example, sea ice in summer, and then say, what does that link to? One thing it's linked to is the Gulf Stream, and another is the Greenland ice sheet. So if one of these go, the possibility is that this will go, and that'll cause this to go, and that'll cause this to go. In other words, there are a set of cascades. That's what they're talking about there. So have a look at that sort of work. Start reading climate scientists. Ignore economists on the issue. And we should also start from the laws of thermodynamics, and that's where I want to go to now, because what we've had in economics ever since Adam Smith, we've modelled output as a function of labour and capital. Okay? And if you look at you've all done, who's doing economics here? And who's not? Okay. And mathematics a bit scary, or it's okay?
No, it's okay.
Okay. Because this is the sort of equation they use. They say that output is some function of labour raised to a power times capital to another power, and the sum is 1. And what that means is you double inputs, you double outputs. It's what they call constant returns to scale. So that part of it I don't particularly object to. But they lump a whole lot of stuff here in what they call total factor productivity, that they assume rises over time. And post-Keynesians, what they tend to use, and I'm one of they in this case, is a function called the Leontief production function, where you say output is a minimum of what they call labour productivity multiplied by how many workers you have, or capital divided by a capital output ratio. Whichever is the minimum, that's what produces output. I tend just to go straight from here to this one. I'll explain why in a moment. Now, energy doesn't turn up in any of those models. And this has been a long-running problem in economics ever since Adam Smith. And in fact, I blame Smith for it. Okay? Because Smith actually learned from the physicocrats. And this is a French school of thought. Have you heard of the name called Francois Quesnay? The tableau économique? Some of you have, okay. Quesnay and his school of thought they were called the physiocrats because Quesnay was the king's physician, but the king wasn't ill all that often, so he had an enormous amount of free time to research other things. And what they did at the time is when we started to discover, through autopsies, all these tubes inside the body. And so the whole idea of circulation became their model. And that's a better analogy than mechanics, which economists pretty much use. So they had this idea of flows, and that's what the tableau économique is about. But they also argue that all wealth comes from the land. And one of the reasons for this is quite simple, and that is that when you plant one seed, you get a plant back with thousands of those seeds. You're getting a free gift. They called it a free gift of nature. And they said that's where wealth comes from, and they were right. Smith said it's division of labour. He was wrong. And ever since then, I'll explain why in a moment, ever since then we've continued debating whether labour or capital produce the output. The answer is neither of the above, it's energy. And the reason is if you talk about having production without energy, then you're violating absolutely fundamental laws of economics. And this is one of my favourite quotes about it from a 1930s version of Stephen Hawkins, if you like, a physicist who popularised physics as well. So this man, Sir Arthur Eddington, did the experiment that verified Einstein's general theory of relativity. They went to see, when they knew that there was going to be a particular movement of a star behind the sun, they could measure the deviation of light if there was. If there was no deviation, Einstein was wrong. If the deviation was 0.08 of a degree, I think it was, Einstein was right. They found 0.08 of a degree. So he proved empirically the general theory of relativity. Now he wrote this paper saying about what about the laws of economics, physics. He said the law that entropy, which is effectively disorder, increases, holds, I think, the supreme position amongst the laws of nature. If somebody's theory is inconsistent with Maxwell, well, tough luck for Maxwell. If it's contradicted by experiment, well, you know, these experimenters get things wrong sometimes. But if your theory is against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There is nothing for it but to collapse in deepest humiliation. That is the state of all economic theories today, including post-Keynesian. Okay? Not as badly, because post-Keynesian by accident has done the right thing. I'll show you why in a moment. So what we get out of the laws of thermodynamics, and the law of the entropy law fundamentally says waste is inevitable. Waste is not an externality you can get rid of with market, putting market price on carbon and therefore pricing the externality and getting rid of waste. Waste is inevitable. The reason is that you need energy to turn potential energy into work. Imagine you've got a waterfall like this. Okay? The only way you can get that waterfall to turn is if there's a gap between where the water comes in and where the water comes out. Okay? But that gap is not the whole distance water could fall. Okay? If it's further down, there's energy you're not taking advantage of, and we're talking all the way to the middle of the planet here. So I can't generate work unless there's a gap between where work starts and where it ends, where water starts, where it ends. And the same thing applies in general. The maximum you can extract from an energy source depends upon the source itself and where it's used. So if I try to extract energy from a solar cell on the planet, I have a limit compared to the energy I can extract if I had that solar cell off the planet. The background temperature level matters. So in general, you can do work if the energy of the source is greater than the energy of the surroundings. And the fundamental idea is called a heat pump. There's a wonderful piece of research by a very young researcher when he did it in the 19th century called Carnot. And he worked out that you have what he called you could have a heat engine that used heat to do mechanical work. So you can do work at the heat source. This heat engine is warmer than the environment. Okay? But you've got to dump it. You've got to dump that waste into the environment to actually do work. So you have a heat engine, let's say it's operating at 500 degrees Celsius, and the environment's 25 degrees. Then there's a flow of heat from the engine to the environment, and you can extract some of that to do work. But if you have, let's say you want to take that same heat engine to Venus, and it's operating at 500 degrees, and the temperature's 500 degrees, there's no difference. There'll be no flow of heat to exploit in the first place in the heat engine. So you've got to have an environment you can dump the waste into. Okay, that's a prerequisite for exploiting heat-based energy. That, of course, includes our power stations. Now, you've got to exchange that heat with an external system. Otherwise, you can't extract energy. And the reason is a closed system degrades to a uniform temperature over time. This is the law of thermodynamics, the second law. So you get a power system working because you dump waste into the environment. So here you have a boiler over here, and you're heating up the temperature. That turns a turbine. If you took this stage out, what would happen over time is, roughly speaking, the entire closed loop would reach the same temperature and this wouldn't spin. So the only reason that generates power is because you're dumping the waste heat over here. So you necessarily have to degrade the environment to take advantage of that energy, working with heat-based systems. So that was completely isolated. Then you wouldn't get any work at all. Now, if you look at what economics teaches you, it starts with this thing called the circular flow diagram. Nothing there. Hey, that's cool. Right, neat. Okay, so you've got this nice little circular flow. Notice there's no input from the outside, and there's no waste from the outside. That's totally wrong. Another one, I think this is from Mankey. Everything's internal to the economy. There's no economic input, and there's no dumping of something outside the economy. So you've got everything is produced by the economy itself, and everything's consumed inside the economy. Now that implies that you can produce inputs just with the economy itself without taking advantage of things you find for free in the environment, like a coal reserve or oil or nuclear or whatever. That violates the first law of thermodynamics. Okay. And it's also saying that a closed system can produce increasing order over time, because if you think about what happens with the economy, we're taking raw materials of some description, which is ignored in that diagram, and turning into more refined things. And what we have is technology, like my pointer system here, improves over time. Okay? And we've got no waste going on. That violates the second law. Production without waste is not possible, but our starting economic theory assumes that it is. So we're exploiting solar fuel, fossil fuels, which are of course frozen solar energy, and nuclear. So we can't produce energy. That's the first law of thermodynamics. We can change the form that it takes, but the amount of energy is conserved. And that's the first fundamental law of thermodynamics. So we only exploit existing energy, and that includes nuclear power, because that's been formed in supernovas, just a more complicated version of sunshine. You necessarily generate waste, so you can minimise it, but you can't get rid of it. You can't eliminate it. And those are the second and third laws. Now, if you want to make that diagram realistic, this is what you have to add to it. You have to have energy inputs from the non-man-made, person-made environment, and waste injected back into the environment. Unless you have those two, your model's unrealistic. So I take that model. Here's the sun. There's coal. And there's some nuclear as well. We find those on the planet. We exploit that energy, and that then enables us to do useful work, which is how I regard GDP. We necessarily dump waste back into the environment. That's beginning to be realistic. That's the sort of perspective we need to start from the first point. So just to explain those laws, why can't we produce without using already existing energy? Why can't we produce without reducing waste? Well, it's the laws of thermodynamics. And they were empirically derived across the time that economics, neoclassical economics, first developed. So if you look at what the neoclassical economists like Volra in particular, but also Jevons, were doing, they were relating back to a period of physics 20 or 30 years earlier, given the time lags and publication and material getting out of a specialised area like physics into the general public where economists can read the books. They didn't twig to this development. Marx was looking at it, and there's some parts of Marx where he actually correctly states the laws of thermodynamics as they apply to his idea of the labour theory of value. But neoclassical economists missed all that, and what Phil Murawski describes their work as, he calls it energetics, before we actually understood the actual role of energy. Okay, so there was a sort of mechanistic period in physics before energy was properly understood and these laws were understood. That's when neoclassical developed its obsession with equilibrium. So this all happened after Marx had developed the labour theory of value, after neoclassical work started to develop, and they take complicated mathematics. It's mathematics that I will struggle to get my head around again, but there's a good mathematics joke about it. It actually comes from Allen Ginsberg, the pop poet from the 1960s, and his joke rule was, first law is you can't win. Okay. Second law is you can't break even. And the third law is you can't leave the game. Great rules, eh? Well, the way it goes is you can't win, you can only break even. You can only break even if you can find a place in the universe that is absolute zero. There is no such place. Okay? That's the basic idea. So translating it, you can't create or destroy energy. You can change its form, but you can't create or destroy it. The maximum amount you can actually use to make useful work is limited by the capacity to dump that waste into a background area. And if the background area is above absolute zero, then there's some energy available you can't make use of. So let's go to trying to find a place where the universe is at absolute zero. There's no such place. Okay? We've reached experimentally, by inputting energy, we've driven fundamental particles down to almost absolute zero. Okay? We're putting energy in to do that. We can't find a place where we can do it for free. So that's the fundamental thing that physicists and engineers have to get their heads around to some extent. It's very complicated material to understand, but that's the starting point of physics and engineering, and economists completely miss it. So in that sense, even post-Keynesian work has got nothing fundamental to say about this as yet. So the problem I faced for some substantial time is it possible to make our models of production consistent with thermodynamics. And the way I got the insight, this is how things occur to me. It's never sitting down working at the computer that gets the insight. It's walking around doing something else and something happens back here and I get an idea and it works. And I was in a colleague's house in Paris, which was full of statues. Went to the bathroom, walking back in the bathroom, and bang, this idea pops in my head. Labour without energy is a corpse. Capital without energy is a sculpture. They both need energy to do useful work. So mathematically, what economists were doing before this is saying, well, we have labour and capital, we need to add energy as the third input. And what the sense they said, no, you don't do that. You say energy is an input to the other two, without which they can't do anything. That's all it takes. So you have labour and capital as a means to convert energy into useful work. And the simple way I went about it was say, let's make E capital lambda as the input for labour, and E capital kappa, which is the Greek letter, as the energy input for machines. And then I replaced labour at time t and capital at time t with labour using E lambda at time t and K using E kappa at time t. That's all it takes. And then what you've got is, obviously, if the energy input at that time is 0, so is the output. Okay? Now, the energy plays an essential role just by that simple reworking. If you have no energy in, you've got no energy out, no output out. And you'll get waste as well, because to convert the energy input into useful work, there's going to be an efficiency with which we do that, and it'll be substantially less than 1, actually less than 0.5. So what I bring is to bring in Q, define Q as a Cobb-Douglas production function in terms of energy alone. So Q's in terms of energy. I'm going to give you all these. Please take notes, because it's a good idea for your brain. But you don't have to if you're not taking them. You can keep on doing it. You learn a lot by writing stuff down, definitely. But I'm going to give you the slides as well for those who don't do it, so don't worry about having to keep up at speed here. So how do I define E lambda and E kappa? Well, the simplest way is to say that labour using energy at time t is the number of workers multiplied by the energy each worker consumes per day, multiplied by the efficiency with which that energy is turned into useful work. And then a similar thing for capital. But of course the hard part is how you define K. That's the number of workers, that's energy consumption per worker, which is massive these days, and that's the efficiency with which it's turned into useful work, which is trivial these days. Machines, same thing, work out how to measure K, which is a decent PhD thesis. The energy consumption per machine, which started, if you think back in time in terms of the James Watt steam engine, the energy consumption of a James Watt steam engine was roughly 10 tonnes of coal per day. Okay. Now, what about today? The energy input of my favourite machine these days with the Falcon 9 rocket is about 10 tonnes per second. That's about a 25,000 increase in the amount of energy going through. And that's the conversion of the efficiency of conversion into useful work. So do that, and then what I get is L and K are much the same as the existing production function. EL has risen exponentially over time. The amount of energy you're consuming is astronomical compared to ordinary people 30 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. You're consuming more energy than a king or queen. Okay. But the useful capacity that you can do with that is trivial. So I define E little l, which is energy consumed per worker, multiplied by the efficiency with which that's turned into useful work, as a constant. It's roughly 90 watts. If you look about the amount of energy a human being can do for a sustained period, like working for a full day, it's about 90 joules per 90 watts. I'm still getting used to all my terms in energy again. But like the power of an incandescent light bulb. That's about the energy an unskilled worker puts into a manufacturing process. And that hasn't changed over time. But EK has risen exponentially. Okay, it's gone from, as I said, 10 tonnes per day to 10 tonnes per second for a representative machine. Now, EK is bounded between 0 and 1. And it's actually got to be less than 0.5 because of the second law of thermodynamics. So I feed those back into the Cobb-Douglas production function and see what happens. And you know the whole idea about the solar residual? You've been taught that? Okay, it's the problem that when economists tried to work out the contribution to growth from labour and capital, and there's some more, they didn't actually have a term for A in the first place. If you look at the original Cobb-Douglas production function, it had a constant multiplied by L to the alpha and K to the 1 minus alpha. And when they did the mathematics, they worked out there was no growth, virtually no growth. So they had to include an A term to get growth. And when they measured it again, 85% or more of the growth was due to this, what they call total factor productivity. And that's become an obsession. There's actually a recent paper by Andy Haldane, who's the chief economist for one of the chiefs of the Bank of England, a great guy too, by the way. And Andy's still talking about this, the total factor productivity paradox. Where does it come from? Well, what I find is it's actually that so-called paradox or residual or mystery is the contribution of the energy of the typical machine. It's no wonder that A term includes a huge amount of the production increase over time. So you also, not only can you explain where that A term comes from, you find reasons to get rid of the usual value they put in those coefficients, which put a very high coefficient for labour and a very low one for machinery. Should be the other way around, and I'll show you why in a moment. So here's the original CobbDouglas paper back in the American Economic Association in the 1930s. You see they've got a term there, B, and it's 1.01, not a variable at all. So the variable later was a fudge to make up for the fact that the model didn't fit the data outside the particular region they looked at, and the data in fitting the function. So I'm going to start with this saying Q, which is output measured in terms of energy, is equal to L, labour input to the 1 minus alpha, and K times E, K to the alpha, and then substitute those terms in. Now it's what one of my old mathematics lecturers called money for old rope. Okay, it's very mechanical. I'm going to go through it quickly, but it's easy for you to do yourselves. So I get that expression, and then I gather my terms, and what I get, there's the original Cobb-Douglas production function. Okay? There's the energy contribution of the typical machine at the time. And that's the other one's a constant. E to the 1 minus alpha is going to be pretty much, that's the 90 watts. Okay? So your A term is not total factor productivity at all. It's the energy output of a representative machine. The useful work done by a machine. And that useful work has risen dramatically over time. Okay, we could break it down. We have to work out a way of measuring how many machines there are, because you cannot add this to that. Okay, I can't put these together and say 1 plus 1 equals 2. Okay, but I could put two of you together and say you two are equal to two unskilled workers. Okay, I can add your time together easily. Imagine there's uniformity. I can't add the machinery. So I've got to add them. Straffer used the idea of adding them, use what he called dated labour. I think it's to be done using dated energy. I haven't actually tried to do yet. That's one of the next tasks I want to get onto. And then what about the value for this alpha component? Because when you look at it, the Cobb-Douglas used alpha is equal to 0.25, based on the fact at the time that the capitalists got about 25% of national income, and workers got 75%. And when they did the fitting of the data, they got much the same numbers out again. So they thought the theory of the model seemed to justify the distribution of income and almost explain it. Now most models will do 0.3 today, but why on earth, when we're now working just everything's in terms of energy now? That's Q's a measure in energy, that's a measure in energy, that's a measure in energy. Why should we have a huge exponent to 90 watts per worker and a trivial one to the energy for machinery? What's going on? Well, of all things, I'm going to compliment Mankiw. Never thought I'd be doing this. But Gregory Mankiw wrote an interesting paper on the wealth of nations, and he said, if you look at the dilemma, like the Cobb-Douglas production function with the exponents chosen by the distribution of income, fitted American data really well. But then, well, let's extend it. Let's compare one country to another, and then they found it goes totally haywire. The rates of growth they assume, the income distribution, everything about it is nonsense unless they change the value of alpha. So he said we should move it from 1/3, saying the exponent for capital is 0.3 or thereabouts, to 0.7 pretty much, because we now get all the international data now makes sense. So it's a good paper on that front, and dramatically improve the empirical fit of the Cobb-Douglas to cross-country comparisons. So that was a good little idea there. And he said if we actually have twice the component we normally use, we get rid of a whole lot of problems by changing one parameter. And that's actually good thinking for a neoclassical economist. Now, how to justify it? Well, he went through and said, well, we can argue there's positive externalities, that sort of thing. And then capital's much broader. We've got to include human capital as well. Now, this is an instance, and it's quite typical in economics, of thinking within your paradigm. Okay? You have something that doesn't make sense. You find a way to interpret it. You still try to make sense of that within your paradigm. Now, sometimes you have to abandon the paradigm. And neoclassical economics we should have abandoned 100 years ago. Strictly speaking, 90 years ago. We knew enough to throw it away then. We kept it going in the meantime. So his first proposal, my first proposal, I say our because I'm working with a physicist and a mathematician and a meteorologist on this work. If once you do the work that I've done with the CobbDouglas, the exponent for the energy output of the machine is the same as the exponent for the number of machines. Okay? It's both using alpha. So to put a higher value on alpha, you're recognising the role of energy in production, which of course has been ignored until now. Now, people have, who has used the CobbDouglas production function or seen it in lectures? Okay. The main reason they like it, it confirms the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. And they, say, if Douglas had found, Douglas did the empirics, Cobb came up with the mathematics, that the shares were the other way around, we would never have been bothering about it. So the fact that the regression fitted the empirical data for income distribution was a major reason why it was adopted in the 1930s when it was. And then this guy Fisher, who wrote the article, says if the fact that the estimated aggregate production functions explain wages fairly well is a statistical artifact, then it is certainly not an obvious one. And he's right. You've got to think. Not something neoclassicals are good at. And the person who did this, so actually talking about him earlier at the back there, was Anwar Sheikh. Beautiful paper, one of my favourite papers in the whole of economics, called Laws of Production and Laws of Algebra, the Humbug Production Function. It's a beautiful piece of writing. Highly recommend reading it. And there's two more papers that are more accessible. I want to explain what was going on with that in a moment. I'll bring it up a later slide. I think I've gone one slide past where I wanted to go. So that's looking at the CobbDouglas production function. I've now explained A as the energy contribution of the typical machine. And I've argued for a much higher value for alpha because a low one just doesn't make sense. It's based on a mathematical farce. Well, let's try the same thing with the Leontief, and this is very early work, very new work. So I'm going to say output is capacity utilization multiplied by capital divided by the labour output ratio, and I'm going to make that equal to A multiplied by L, where A is normally called labour productivity. Now, if I bring in the same idea of saying energy is measuring output in terms of energy, then I've got this expression here, and I just have to expand that out. Quite simple, simpler than doing it with the CobbDouglas production function. So this is an energy version of Leontief. We normally work with what you might call a widget or a corn economy model. K. If you think about saying you've got a single commodity called Y and a single machinery called K, what you're producing is basically imagining an economy where all you use is corn. We plant corn, it turns into output, okay? We store corn, that's capital. Okay? We eat corn, that's our wage. Okay? That's why basically corn economy is the model we're actually working with. So you need to work some sort of conversion factor between the widget economy, which is Y, and the energy economy, which is Q. So I'm saying, well, I'm going to say widgets here are equal to energy divided by energy per widget. Quite simple. Output in widgets, output in energy, a conversion factor. Now, cancel common terms, and I end up with 1 over V, which is the inverse of what we call capital output ratio, is equal to this EK, which is the energy per machine, multiplied by the efficiency of conversion of energy into useful work, divided by energy per widget. Okay? Well, a little guide to go on. What do you do with that model? Well, you use terms that have got the same dimensions, because EK is energy, EY is energy. 1 over V is a ratio, so is EK. So you equate them. They're scalars, they're energy. And what do you find out of that? Energy per widget equals the unit consumption of the machine, so EY equal to EK. And the capital output ratio is actually the inverse of the ratio of energy input to useful work. So I'll show you that. Oh, pardon me, that went too quickly there. So if you look at the capital divided by output, K divided by Y, that's how V is defined. And that's been falling over time. Now this is what post-Keynesian economists have been using. Generally speaking, we've assumed that it's a constant. That's obviously wrong, okay? But not too badly wrong, because we're going from 3.9 to 3.1. Still in the range of about 3.5, okay? But it's actually the inverse of the efficiency with which we turn energy into useful work. So if I then invert that, what I'm finding is over time we've been getting more efficient. But we're still well below 0.33. Remember I mentioned that the maxima had to be less than 0.5 because of the second law? This is what we're empirically finding. Now I think that's going to reverse in the future, because when we start getting harder and find it harder and harder to get energy out and use it, whether that's because of depleting energy or finding we simply can't use high density energy like oil anymore, we've got to use low density energy like solar, it's going to decline. Now back to the Cobb-Douglas production function. Has anybody taken a look at that paper by Shake, the Humbug production function? You have, good, cool. Okay, Sam, you get away scot-free, that's good. You enjoy it?
Yes.
It's a great piece of writing, isn't it? Yeah. So we define income as wages plus profits. Okay? And then that's the definition. Now we're going to make the assumption that there's a uniform wage and a uniform rate of return on capital. So I've got W, Y is now equal to W times L plus R times K. Differentiate with respect to time. And then I'm going to bring in terms of L over L, W over W, K over K, and R over R. And what I gets messy. It's just simply applying the chain rule a few times. It's simple calculus. Again, what my mathematics lecturer called money for old rope. You literally can get an organ grinder to do this. Okay? So I've done all that stuff, and then I rearrange in terms of income share. So but what I've got now, I've gone from a definition for output to a definition of the rate of growth in percentage terms. Okay? That's all I've done by going from there to there. And I've brought in these terms which are all one, so it doesn't change anything. Rearrange it in terms of income share. So I now have W times L, which is the wages share, divided by Y, multiplied by the labour terms. I've got over here R times K, which is the profit share, multiplied by the capital terms. Now substitute that R over K is equal to alpha, and WL is equal to 1 minus alpha, so I'm showing the share and output as alpha, and assume that it's relatively constant, which it is. It doesn't change rapidly over time. It's been going down for workers, but it doesn't change all that much. And I can then say the differential, that is actually the differential of a log. Okay, so I've now got all this is the same thing, differentials of logs. Then I integrate that, so I get the log expression in terms of logs. And finally I take the exponential, and what do I get? I get the Cobb-Douglas production function, where A is equal to W, the wage rate to 1 minus alpha, times the rate of profit to alpha. So all that shenanigans they do to derive this stuff, that's the Cobb-Douglas production function. No wonder it gets a high regression when you regress it against income distribution data, because you can derive it from income distribution data. That was the point of the humbug production function. Anything will fit, including the word humbug, which is what Shake does in that beautiful paper. So I want to show another way now, and that, in that sense, the Cobb-Douglas production function, I'm doing it so neoclassicals will read what I write, but I couldn't give a shit about it as a model. It's just not a model at all. The Leontief is accurate because there is a linear relationship between energy input to machines and the amount of output. There isn't easy substitutability. If you reduce the amount of energy going to a production line, it doesn't make any difference. You throw 1,000 more workers at it, you won't get more output. Okay? The energy determines the rate of production. And I had a funny little instance, just one of my far too many airline trips, bumped into an engineer at an airport, and he told me he worked in what are called machines that make RFID chips. You know what RFID chips are? Okay, most of you do. They're the chips that lets you physically locate where something is on the planet. They're used for tracking. His machine, from memory, took 9 workers to make 14 million chips per year. He said, but in China, in the factory in China, he had no idea why there were 16 workers making 9 million units per year. The extra workers reduced output. He had no idea why they were there, and the machine worked less well with them. The flexibility that the neoclassical assume just isn't there. The energy into the machine determines the output level, and then the capacity used of the machine determines how many workers you hire. So in that sense, even though the post-Keynesians were just as wrong as the neoclassicals for leaving energy out of production, it's very simple to bring it in by saying V is 1 over the energy efficiency ratio. Okay? So in that sense, much less work necessary to bring in the energy into the post-Keynesian world. So total factor productivity, all that stuff is a waste of time. But what I've done here is show how you can link energy to ecology now. So the amount of energy that's available and the cost of that necessarily affects how the economy performs. So we've now got a link with energy inside there. And necessarily, more GDP causes pollution. The simplest example is CO2. I would like to see the focus broadening beyond carbon dioxide, because that's where all this bloody obfuscation from climate change deniers can come in. If you look at also what we're doing to the insects on the planet, which apparently involves light pollution more than anything else, what happens to ecosystems, destroying coral reefs, what that'll do to fish populations. There's an enormous amount of data out there of the damage we're doing to the planet. And if you factor that in and just focus on CO2, it's like going to the doctor, and the doctor takes your pulse and says, oh, you're okay, you can go home. You say, what about this lump on my neck? Okay. There's much, much more to it than just carbon dioxide. It makes it easy for the neoclassical climate change deniers to get away with it. So if we have a declining energy return and energy invested, we'll find the efficiency of that work conversion falling over time as well. That's the point I mentioned earlier. So I want to show you now modelling using Minsky and modelling what's called the Goodwin cycle, which has wages and it has capital and labour, but it doesn't have bankers in this stuff, which is what I've done. And just to show you potential feedback, I've got a hypothetical effect of exhausting the supply of fossil fuel on GDP and see what happens when that occurs. And you also necessarily accumulate waste. So it's fairly simple to bring this stuff in. So this is what I call an illustrative model, and I'm going to bring it up now and run it on my machine. And this is the version of Minsky which has a bug in it, so I've got to be careful I don't actually generate the bug. So this we'll just zoom in here. Okay. This is saying gross investment minus depreciation gives you the rate of change of the capital stock. You've got to make the capital stock by utilisation level. I'm just making it 1 here for the simplicity of it. Capital stock times energy times efficiency. That's the same equation I showed you beforehand. Okay? And that then generates output, and I divide the output by that's output in terms of energy, divided by energy per unit, and I get the physical output. And then the rest of this is the same model as the basic Goodwin model, which is the basis of my model of Minsky. And I've also brought in here depletion of resources. So you have fixed level of fossil fuel resources that begin in year 0, which is 1776, when the James Watt steam engine was invented, and minus depletion divided by those resources gives you your level of output. And I've got over here a level of fossil fuels at which you start at. Now the Goodwin model is a typical dynamic model. It's non-equilibrium. When you simulate it, you get a process of dynamic change. So what you get is cycles in wages and employment, and they go indefinitely. And you've got output coming out over here, and I've got outputs down here and waste is up there, because again of that efficiency element, you're creating more waste energy than you are useful work out of that energy. And for a long time, nothing appears to change. I've got the waste accumulating, and I haven't got a feedback from the waste to output yet. That's a next stage in developing the model. Very simple model. And notice up here, I've got fossil fuel resources. There's where you start with, which is with a black line, and this is what you've got left, which is the green line. And for a long time, they're exactly the same, because you've only got a small number of years you've looked forward. This is 50 years since the James Watt steam engine. Keep it going on for a while, and then things start to get a bit awry. You start to delete those fossil fuels, it feeds back on your capacity to produce output, and ultimately you collapse. Now that's system dynamics thinking. Very simple. I haven't fitted it to data. I'm assuming there's no alternative apart from fossil fuel energy. But it's the beginning of a foundation of building dynamic models of this. And this is replicating what was done on the limits to growth. Okay? Trying to make it more understandable than limits to growth. I've got to improve the graphics of Minsky over time, but that's quite possible to do that. Now, another piece of work I'm doing is bringing in what I'm not doing it. This is my friend Tim Garrett, who's a meteorologist whose specialisation is the formation of snowflakes. Okay? So what he argued is he used a totally thermodynamical analogy and said we can think about the economy as a thermodynamic engine. And his analogy here is clouds. A cloud will form, a tornado cyclone will form because there's an energy source. Let's say you're over the Atlantic Ocean in summer, late summer. It's hot. That gives you a rising energy yield, which forms a set of clouds and finally a cyclone. The gap between the energy that you've got in the bottom, which is the heat of the ocean, and the energy where you dissipate the heat, the environment of the cloud, that's what fuels the whole machine. And then you've got to dump that ultimately into the surrounding environment as well. So he made exactly the same analogy for human society. He said human society is this system here. Okay, that's us. That's the available energy, and this is where we dump the waste. And then we expand the society by expanding the interface we have to those available energy resources. And the height tells you the energy return on the energy invested. So it's a very interesting way of approaching economics, completely from the point of view of thermodynamics. And so that's the top is the general thermodynamics. The bottom is this idea of energy reservoirs, civilization, and the surroundings. And we have to be dumping the waste into the surrounding. You can't, if you price it out of existence, you price out capitalism. Okay? The whole idea of being able to solve this by the price system is ignorant of the laws of thermodynamics. So there's production. You expand the interface, society expands. And what he gets out of that work is a link between wealth as the integral of GDP and energy. I've got a different approach. I link energy to GDP, so we have to reconcile our work over time. But here's that Minsky model done in Minsky, pardon me. And Minsky can model any dynamic system. It's not just for economic modelling. It's best for that because I've included the role of the financial sector. But this is that same model that Tim has put together. So there you have global wealth. So W stands for wealth, not wages, which has a direct conversion to the energy usage. And then to get that energy usage, you're generating carbon dioxide, which you may be able to reduce the carbon level over time. So one of the control components is this rate of carbonisation here. And then what he gets is a link between atmospheric CO2 and GDP versus CO2. And he has fitted this to some extent to the empirical data, but this is his rough prediction if we don't decarbonise of what's going to happen to global GDP. And you get a point where it starts turning, in terms of an increment to wealth, negative. What that means is we're still eating, but we're eating the furniture. Okay? We're degrading our own capital stock, and that's the real danger of climate change that is left out of all these neoclassical models. They damage GDP, they don't damage the capital stock. This is saying we're going to be eating our capital stock to stay alive. If you can actually increase the rate of carbonisation, which you can do just by putting the arrow key on that variable and pressing up or down or sideways a bit, then you might be able to get to a situation where that's even worse. I'm going to make it positive. Let's go the other way. Decarbonise. Do that, and you might have a sustainable planet. No, that doesn't work either. Okay. And that's the sort of idea. Play with these things and get an idea where you've got a sustainable range. And that's what the limits of growth did back in the 1970s, with a much more complicated model than this, and very cumbersome technology back in the 1970s. It cost over $1 million to do the coding and use the computer time to build those models. The PDF of the limits to growth is available online. Download it, read it. Get a feeling of what they were doing. Yeah?
What does the wealth keep going on?
Pardon?
What is wealth?
Wealth is the integral of GDP. Okay. It's Tim's own approach there, which works, but it's different to what I'm using. So we're doing both approaches at once. What it actually finds out is saying unless we decarbonise, we're going to have negative change in wealth. And that's the real danger. That's what's being left out by the neoclassical. When you look at what is done by Nordhaus with that damage function of his, he's dividing GDP by a damage function, where GDP is a CobbDouglas production function, where labour continues growing indefinitely and so does capital. Okay? So he's leaving out the so-called feed. He calls it integrated. No, it's not. He calls it dynamic. No, it's not. Okay? It's another computable equilibrium model. So that's the background there. I'll put all the references here I mentioned in the presentation. So I'll give this to Sam or Alan, and you take it from there. That'll get you started on this work. I publish all my work on a website called Patreon, which you may or may not have seen. Most of my stuff there is freely available. Okay? I've got people who are supporting me at $1 a month and up, but I actually asked them at one stage, do you want me to make this stuff just for you, or would you prefer to make it public? And they said, if you want your material out there, we're happy to have it public. So you don't have to subscribe to my website to go there and check it out, most of the time. There are some things I make just for patrons, but not very many. So that's the world.